I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is something that you guys should probably be aware of given all of the previous reporting we've already talked about with the next generation iMac Pro. This is coming straight from the horse's mouth, if that horse was Ross Young, who is starting to show some cracks in his reliability a little bit. It's not completely demolished, but certainly something we're gonna have to be wary of for future Ross Young reporting. Let's begin. I thought he was the GOAT. I thought he was perfect. I thought he couldn't make a mistake. But Ross Young technically hasn't been proven wrong, but he's starting to do one of those things that really irks me when leakers do, because it shows that they either spoke too soon or something, or were claiming something was going to happen before they actually knew it. Also, that can lead into a slippery slope of lying or just straight up guessing a lot of the time, and people, of course, expecting you to be correct are going to start treating your word as fact. We shouldn't do that. This is why we shouldn't trust anyone with 100% accuracy, except all faithful Coin X. When the world needed him most, he vanished. But Ross Young is coming forward and saying not to expect the 2022 iMac Pro at the spring event. It's now looking more like those displays and supplies that computer needs are not going to be ready until the summertime. And if that wasn't bad enough news for you, he's saying that's just when the display parts will start shipping. When the iMac Pro actually releases, he's saying is probably going to be closer to September, which is freaking iPhone season, which just means essentially if you're waiting for the M1 Pro and M1 Max to find their way into a desktop all-in-one, you might end up waiting even longer than we originally thought, which is a bit of a bummer, and that in itself would kind of ruin my day. So I apologize in advance, but this is looking to get a little bit worse. Hopefully Ross Young ends up being wrong about this, but he's also saying that while the iMac Pro will still be rocking a mini LED display, the local dimming zones are actually going to be fewer and not as intricate as Apple has done with their iPad Pros and MacBook Pros. So as soon as I read this, I was like, Apple, this makes no sense, because first of all, the iMac is bigger. The iMac is thicker. It doesn't have a battery to worry about. So you're telling me the first time Apple adopts mini LED into a thicker, bigger, non-battery life device, suddenly they're going to start skimping on the local dimming zones? For those who don't know what we're talking about, basically mini LED is kind of a fundamentally modified version of LCD, even though it is still technically an LCD in some ways. A traditional LCD display, like you have on most iPads or my current iMac Pro, is just like one giant backlight that dictates all of your brightness, which essentially means that when you have black parts of the display, they can't get all the way black because you have to brighten all the pixels at once. Mini LED, like we have in the most expensive iPad Pro, and of course all the new MacBook Pros have mini LED, have individual dimming zones, which means that those pixels can be close to essentially all the way off when you're showing black content or watching a scene from a movie with darkness, or of course with these weird aspect ratios you get a lot of black bars. It allows for a lot of OLED benefits with deeper blacks and richer colors and brighter HDR content, but without all of the drawbacks of OLED like the burn-in, or I guess that's pretty much it, just no burn-in, which would definitely be a problem on MacBooks and iPads. But I figured because the iMac Pro wasn't going to accommodate a battery or need to be as crazy thin as an iPad Pro or even insanely thin as the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro display lids, that they could go all out with this thing. They could make it their best display possible. You know, of course, give it 120 hertz, give it ProMotion. I don't know why it needs to dynamically change if it's going to be pulling all of its power from the wall anyway, but still, it would frankly just be nice to have an iMac that's got the M1 Pro and got the M1 Max inside it, and it's capable of running at 120 hertz while still retaining all of those great display specifications that the Pro Display XDR is rocking, especially because we still have a 27-inch Intel iMac in the lineup, and because it's got Intel, get that crap out of there. We need to wipe it off the face of the website as soon as possible. So finding out that they're kind of going down on the dimming zones essentially means that blooming and like the edges of the display bleeding could end up being a bigger problem. If you don't have as many individual dimming zones, that means especially if you're looking at a scene from a movie or editing a picture that has a lot of dark spots and a couple of bright subjects throughout the display, it will be easier to notice those dimming zones because when there's less of them, you can't get as precise. So it's really weird for Apple to be moving kind of backwards in this direction, especially on a larger display. You know, that's typically the kind that would get more use from professionals and tech enthusiasts. So I would have thought you would have had the most dimming zones possible, but I don't know. Maybe the display controllers are having a hard time optimizing their software to handle that many dimming zones with mini LED. Doesn't sound like an issue we've really had with iPad Pros or MacBook Pros. It's always felt like a hardware limitation where the supply chains can't build enough of these things, and that kind of prevents them from releasing it. That might still be the problem here, but I'm still confused as to why they would just say we don't need as many dimming zones as a 12.9-inch iPad Pro, even though this is supposed to be a 27-inch display. Perhaps when you start building mini LED at like insane size, like if you start going over 16-inch displays like we have with my MacBook Pro, maybe it gets more complicated. Maybe the power draw is just too heavy, and who knows, maybe Apple wants the side of the iMac Pro to be so thin and narrow so it looks pretty from an angle you'll never look at the computer at, that this has complicated manufacturing, or it's complicated the specs or power draw that the mini LED display is capable of taking. So I'm not going to say this is completely not Apple's fault. They might have some stupid design trend with this because they got to embed the whole computer in the chin and it has to be a certain thinness, and that's what's causing all these issues. But regardless of whose fault it is, we still have to come back and just say the news, and unfortunately just mention that Ross Young came forward with a timeline and a product and is now kind of postponing it a little bit and saying, actually, Apple changed their mind. And the only reason I don't like that is because it gets a lot of analysts and leakers comfortable with the idea of coming forward with things they know and want to treat as news, even if it's not solidified, even if it's not for sure. And that means that maybe he's wrong again. Maybe at the last second he goes, oh, actually this larger iMac isn't an iMac Pro at all. There's no mini LED, and that's how you start getting more and more reports that end up being wrong and setting false expectations. So hopefully by having less dimming zones on the display, that could actually improve the price point. Maybe that's how they're able to achieve a $2,000 starting price, is just by not going crazy overkill with mini LED. Perhaps they decide that the blooming issue isn't widespread enough that it's going to impact the way they manufacture their display, so they're just like, we don't care if there's not as many dimming zones, it's still a great display. And perhaps because this 27-inch iMac is still 16:9, they figured you're not going to have the black bars as often when watching content as you are with a MacBook Pro, which has a 16:10 aspect ratio, and an iPad Pro, which has a 3:4 aspect ratio. Maybe that's the exception, and that helps them bring the price down. That's the only silver lining I could possibly grab from all this. But yeah, it's sounding like we're gonna have to wait a bit longer for this iMac Pro, which unfortunately means if Apple does have a spring event in April or something, pretty much the only things to expect are gonna be an iPhone SE with crappy battery life and 5G, and the iPad Air 5, which is just playing catch up with its younger brother, the iPad Mini 6, which is way better, and maybe it gets the Flash or something basic. There's some chit chat about an M1 Pro or M1 Max Mac Mini coming out, but because Apple can't keep up on the chip shortage with the current MacBook Pros, and the fact that I think the Mac Mini with M1 Pro and M1 Max would sell incredibly well and probably would eat into the sales of iMacs and iMac Pros coming later, I'm gonna predict there's no Mac Mini coming at the spring event, and Apple's only gonna refresh the Mac Mini when the M2 chip comes out alongside the new MacBook Air. I hope I'm wrong about that, because I would absolutely love it if Apple did make an M1 Pro or M1 Max version of the Mac Mini. I just think it would probably cannibalize a bit too much, and that's going to prevent them from doing it. Let me know your thoughts and predictions down in the comments below. Does this news upset you? Are you just gonna have to settle with a MacBook Pro in the meantime? Personally made me very grateful I got a MacBook Pro when I did, because if I was waiting for a desktop version of the M1 Pro or M1 Max, I would have been waiting a heck of a long time now, because we've probably got another 6 or 7 months to go before this iMac Pro launches. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.